Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material, strip away the fluff, and give you the absolute core knowledge you need. Today, we're tackling something absolutely critical. The foundations of the first law of thermodynamics, based on, the concepts in David Gaskell's classic chapter.
Yeah.
If you want to get material science, you have to get energy. And this is ground zero.
It really is. And we're going deeper than just, energy is conserved. The first law is so profound because it does two massive things.
Okay.
First, it properly defines internal energy, U, and enthalpy, H. These are the state variables we live by.
Right.
And second, it formalizes the huge difference between energy as heat, Q, and energy as work, W. That idea that the quality of the energy matters, that's the real conceptual jump.
And to really get that jump, you have to go back a bit, right? To the 18th century.
Oh, absolutely.
The idea back then was this caloric theory. Heat was like an invisible fluid that floated around.
Yeah, a substance. But then you get Count Rumford in 1798, boring cannons, and he sees that the heat he's generating is, well, it's basically proportional to how much mechanical work he's doing.
He's proving it's not a fluid. It's a consequence of motion, of friction.
It's a beautiful piece of science history. So Rumford shows the link exists, but then James Prescott Joule comes along and actually quantifies it.
With the paddle wheels.
With the paddle wheels and the insulated water, right?
Yeah.
He puts the whole thing on a solid mathematical footing. He gives us the mechanical equivalent of heat, the conversion factor, about 0.2389 calories per joule.
So we have the relationship, but here's the crucial thermodynamic idea. Heat, Q, and work, WR. They're process quantities.
Path-dependent, highly path-dependent.
Right. How you do the change matters. Push a piston fast versus slow, you get different work.
Right.
But these processes change something intrinsic about the system.
And we need a way to talk about that final state without caring about the messy path it took to get there.
Which brings us to our first state function.
Internal energy, U. This is Joule's other massive contribution. He showed that from an adiabatic system, one that's perfectly insulated, the work you do to get from state 1 to state 2 is exactly the same no matter how you do it.
I always think of it like gravitational potential energy. The work to lift a box to the 5th floor is the same if you take the stairs or an elevator.
Or catapult.
Or catapult, exactly. Only the start and end points matter.
That's it. U is the same. In an adiabatic process where heat Q is 0, the change in internal energy, delta U, is just equal to the work done.
Okay, but we have to get the signs right. Gaskell's convention can be tricky.
It can. So work, W, done by the system is positive. The system uses up its own energy, so U goes down.
And heat, Q, absorbed by the system is positive. That's endothermic. The system gains energy, so U goes up.
Exactly. And that sets up the full generalized first law. The change in internal energy, delta U, equals the heat you put in minus the work the system does.
So Q minus W.
Delta U equals Q minus W. And this is the profound part. You're taking the algebraic sum of two path-dependent things, heat and work, and you get a result, delta U, that is completely path-independent.
That's amazing when you think about it.
It is. Imagine a pressure-volume diagram. You can take a gas from state 1 to state 2 along 3 totally different paths. The work done, which is the area under each curve, is wildly different for each one.
But the final internal energy.
A final delta U is identical for all 3. That's the power of a state function. You can just ignore the process and focus on the result.
And that's our ultimate simplification tool. Because a state is fixed by just 2 variables, right? Like temperature and volume.
So we can choose processes where we hold one of them constant, just to make the math easier.
Let's do constant volume first. Isochoric.
Okay. If volume is fixed, then no PDV work can be done. So W is 0.
Which means the first law just becomes
delta U equals Q sub V. The change in internal energy is literally just the heat you pumped in or pulled out. And that relationship is so fundamental, it actually defines the constant volume heat capacity, CV.
But, that's not super practical, is it? Most of the time, in a lab or a factory, you're not working in a perfectly sealed, rigid box.
No, you're not. You're working at constant atmospheric pressure, which means constant volume isn't that useful for, say, a chemist. Delta U isn't what they want to measure.
So we need a new tool, a new state variable for constant pressure.
Exactly. And this is where we invent enthalpy H. You just take the first law, you plug in the work for a constant pressure process, which is P delta V, you rearrange the terms a bit.
And you define this new thing H as U plus PV.
You do, and the payoff is huge.
What's the payoff?
For any constant pressure process, the change in enthalpy delta H is equal to the heat you add or remove. delta H equals Q sub P.
And that's why all the thermodynamic data tables are filled with enthalpy values.
That is exactly why it's the measurable quantity, and it lets us define the constant pressure heat capacity, Cp, which is the one we can usually measure.
And the fact that H is also path independent?
Yeah.
That's a huge deal. I'm thinking of Hess's law.
Perfect application. It's the best example. You have a really complex reaction like iron rusting. Measuring that heat directly might be slow or difficult,
Right.
but because delta H doesn't care about the path, you can just add up the known delta H values for a series of simpler intermediate reactions that get you to the same place. It gives you incredible predictive power.
Okay, let's talk more about heat capacity. We have molar capacities, Cp and Cv. Why is Kp always bigger than Cv? What's the physical reason?
This is such a core concept. Okay, so if you add heat at constant volume, all that energy goes into one job, making the molecules move faster, raising the temperature.
Simple enough.
But if you add that same amount of heat at constant pressure, the system expands. Now the energy has to do two jobs. It has to raise the temperature, and it has to supply the energy to do work, to push back against the surroundings. So you have to pump in more heat to get the same temperature rise.
So Kp has to be bigger to account for that extra expansion work.
It has to be. And for a perfect ideal gas, that relationship is super simple. Cp minus Cv just equals R, the gas constant.
A nice, clean theoretical result.
It is. But real gases aren't ideal. And that problem drove some really famous experiments. Joule's free expansion, for instance. He let a gas expand into a vacuum.
So no heat, no work. Delta U is 0.
Right. And he couldn't detect any temperature change. So he concluded that for a gas, U only depends on temperature.
Which is true, but only for an ideal gas.
Exactly. His experiment just wasn't sensitive enough. The real truth came out later with the Joule-Thomson expansion. They forced a gas through a porous plug, a much more sensitive setup.
And they did see a temperature change.
They did, for real gases, which proved that internal energy, U for real substances, depends on volume and pressure too, not just temperature. It was a huge discovery.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The real world is always messier. So this brings us to looking at specific paths for ideal gases. Let's start with a reversible adiabatic process.
Okay, so adiabatic means no heat. Q is 0. The first law becomes du equals minus pdv. Meaning when the gas expands and does work, its internal energy has to go down because there's no heat coming in to replace it. The gas cools down.
And there's an equation that describes that path on the PV diagram.
There is. It's P times V to the power of gamma equals a constant. And gamma is just the ratio of the heat capacity, Cp over Cv.
Now let's contrast that with the other key path, reversible isothermal.
So isothermal means constant temperature. dT is 0. And for our ideal gas, if temperature doesn't change...
Then U doesn't change. Delta U is 0.
Right. Again, so the first law simplifies beautifully. The work done by the system, WU, is exactly equal to the heat absorbed Q.
So the gas expands, it tries to cool down, but it just sucks in heat from the outside to keep its temperature constant.
Perfectly put. It's constantly refueling itself with thermal energy to do the expansion work.
Okay, so if we picture those two curves on a PV graph, starting from the same point, what do they look like?
This tells you the whole story. If you expand to the same final pressure, the isothermal curve is shallower. It sits above the adiabatic curve.
Which means the area under it is bigger.
A lot bigger. The work done during the isothermal expansion is much greater. And the reason is simple. The isothermal system is constantly importing heat to pay for the work, while the adiabatic system is just running on its own limited internal energy, so its pressure drops off a cliff much faster.
We've been focused on PV work this whole time, but the first law is totally general, isn't it?
Oh, completely. du equals the heat added minus the sum of all forms of work done by the system.
And PD work is just the most common one.
It is, for bulk materials. But in other contexts, you need other terms. For example, the work to magnetize a material, or the electrical work to polarize a dielectric.
You also mentioned surface work. When did that become important?
That one's interesting. It's the energy you need to create new surface area. For a big chunk of metal, you can totally ignore it.
But for nanoparticles.
For nanoparticles, where the surface-to-volume ratio is huge, that surface energy term can become a dominant part of the material's total internal energy. You absolutely have to include it.
This has been a huge amount of ground to cover. If you had to boil it all down, what's the one single synthesis point for someone to take away from this chapter?
The foundation, the absolute bedrock, is that U and H are state functions. Energy gets transferred by these messy path-dependent processes, Q and W, but the final change in the system, delta U or delta H, is path-independent.
And that's our main tool.
It's our primary tool. It means we can calculate the energy change for some crazy real-world process by choosing a much simpler imaginary path in the lab-like constant pressure to get the answer. And the answer is universally true.
Understanding those definitions, the difference between CP and CV, the PV-gamma relationship,
Right.
that's the price of admission for thermodynamics and material science.
It is. And here's a final thought to leave you with. The Joule-Thomson experiment showed that for real materials, U isn't just a function of temperature. It has these subtle dependencies on pressure and volume.
Right.
So if even internal energy is that complex, what does that tell you about how hard it is to accurately model real-world things, like phase transitions, where a tiny energy difference can change everything?
It tells you the ideal gas model is just the first step on a very long road.
A very long, complicated road. The real work is in understanding those subtle dependencies.
A great reminder that there is always more to explore. Thank you for engaging with us on this deep dive into the first law. We'll see you next time.